listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors where we are extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid. I use he, him pronouns.
I'm Rachel Sensenig. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Julie Hoke. I use she, her.
Welcome to the show, y'all. We're excited to have you. Jeff James, author of Giving Up Whiteness, is on the show today. Rachel interviewed him. Tell us, are you excited for that, Rachel?
Yes. It was wonderful. Great to hear his insight.
That's awesome. I hope it blesses you and you pick up his book, too. We're going to end with spiritual show and tell you some things that we're watching that have nourished our soul. But before that, we're going to begin with talkback. And do y'all mind if I lead this part? We didn't discuss it before. We like to divvy up the responsibilities, and I already talk so much, so you're cool with
no,
it, right?
Go ahead. It was your Facebook
It was based on a blog post that I wrote, which I'll add to the show notes, about forgiveness costing us something. I was thinking about that after Desmond Tutu died a few weeks ago, and South African apartheid, and the cost of forgiveness, and how we can't just give it away. There's it costs us something. And I was thinking about how Jesus forgives us and how that costed Jesus something. And I wrote, as much as I valued Christ defeating death through the cross as a primary motif, when I say motif, I mean a way that the cross works. Jesus defeats death, Christ the victor. The wrath of God against evil and the restoration of God's honor are both important ideas to incorporate into our understanding of the forgiveness of Jesus. Reparations need to be made. Wrath needed to be poured out. Wrongs had to be made right, even from God, because God is just and righteous and complete. This isn't retributive, it's restorative. So that was the idea that I wrote, and then a lot of people commented in response, especially in Circle of Hope, because maybe you got this vibe, but we're not like sing all the songs about God's wrath on Sunday type of people. So like because we think that's been weaponized, it's hurt people, it's been abusive, right? Mm-hmm. Julie and Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
So they're interested in this idea that I'm bringing forth. So they're talking. I like that. And here's one we got from my friend Jordan. He was on the podcast a few weeks ago.
Here's what Jordan said. The best explanation of God's wrath that I've heard is that it is what love feels like when our soul is obscured by sin. Love has a purifying dimension to it, not unlike the twinge of shame when someone holds eye-to-eye gaze in love. The difficulty I find is that if that is true, then God's wrath is always perfect, whereas when it comes to people, it's always imperfect. Never totally free of egoic wrath, even when it addresses real harm. Christ suffered innocently, which is a choice that I can make to endure the imperfection of our angers, but of course can never ask someone else to do because of my sin.
So what Jordan's saying is Christ's wrath is perfect. Our wrath is imperfect. And when we make harm happen, when we sin, we may endure imperfect wrath. And the imperfect parts of that wrath that hit us are us innocently suffering like Jesus. Now, we can choose to do that because it's imperfect. However, we cannot ask someone else to endure our imperfect wrath when we've harmed them. We can't ask someone else to endure it, if that makes sense. Is that what you're understanding here? How would you elaborate upon that or talk back to it? Talk back to the talkback.
I just really appreciate how Jordan is naming that our human wrath is imperfect. And yet we can choose to endure it from each other for the sake of Christ. Just, acknowledging that there's some meaning to it. It's always, we can respect one another in it. It's always, there's probably a good reason why somebody's mad. And we can choose to hold that and look a little deeper. But like he's saying, not expect people, not expect to be able to just throw our wrath out there all over everybody. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying what he's saying. Jordan is so brilliant.
Yeah, there's a beauty in drawing in refining our wrath, if you will, our anger, and also enduring too much of it. And being okay with that, like understanding that. I don't think we're not into the territory of being abused. You did something wrong, someone's mad at you, and they react in a way that seems too intense for what you did. Who knows what you bumped into, what kind of trauma you bumped into, what kind of difficulty you bumped into. So we endure that in our patience, and we ask God to help us endure that. But then in the meantime, we become more refined in the things that we say. And that actually means, additionally, and this is why I think God's wrath is important here, we have a response. As opposed to just absorbing it and acting like we don't need to respond. Because God didn't even just absorb it. It didn't absorb our sin. God responded. There's with something. The cross had to happen, So that's at least my view. Rectification had to occur. Reparations had to happen. It wasn't enough for God to forgive us and then say that's it. There had to have been this moment, the crucifixion, this event that changes history, that gives us the chance to be forgiven over and over again by God.
God is moving something. God is changing something. I really appreciate that acknowledgement, Jonny, and Jordan's play on words with love. Because I don't like thinking about God as angry, because I immediately associate the human expressions I've experienced of that are like compulsive and not what God is doing with us through Christ.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine like God's wrath, because the only reference point we have is our human anger, which Jordan calls egoic wrath. That is imperfect. It does seem like it's almost like another thing entirely, like not an emotion per se. I have a hard time even wrapping my mind around what God's wrath is when my human emotion is my reference point,
Like it might not actually be wrath. We're calling it that because we're trying to name something big and important that God is doing.
Sometimes we hear this idea that, and this is worth disputing, but the idea is that God the Father poured out wrath in God the Son. So essentially God killed Jesus in order not to kill humans. And that kind of bloodthirsty image of God is terrible. Like that's... And honestly, it is actually perpetuated by some Christians. It's not just a bad critique. It is sometimes brought forward, It's important, I think, that we don't divide God up into three different pieces as the Trinity. That's a heresy, actually. God is of the same substance in each person. So God is... The subject of God's wrath here is God. It's the same person. That's important. Don't separate God like that. God is making a sacrifice. That's what's happening in this atonement motif. It is a sacrifice. It is not a punishment. So that's just, when you hear that, I want to make that clear, so that and maybe we could even, I think it makes more sense to see it as a humble sacrifice as opposed to like uncontrollable rage. That makes sense. What's on your mind, Rachel?
Well, I'm just thinking about love. Like it is love essentially at its core. This sacrifice you're naming, and like love moves us. I'm also thinking of like the moments in my life where I've been really moved to change. Maybe even by somebody who's like expressing their wrath. I have felt love in that at different times from different people, and it has moved me. So I don't have much of a point, but I'm just thinking about the connection with love there, and Jesus specifically.
That sounds good. Thank you, Rachel.
It's very kind of you, Jonny.
I like it. I like your response. What do you think, Julie? Any last words? You like to be put on the spot.
Yeah, right. I was actually looking for a verse. I'm just thinking about a lot of things that's hard to synthesize in the moment, but I was coming same as you, Rach. I was coming back to Jordan's quote and how he says love has a purifying dimension to it. Sorry, there is a lot of activity happening in my house right now, and it's very loud upstairs. Can you hear all of this?
A little bit.
Super distracted.
Art, were you thinking of the verse of how love compels us?
Which one is that?
I don't even know, but it reminded me of this like intensity, this like movement. How God is trying to move something, change something, communicate something really transformative to us.
Give me a second to look it up.
Christ compels us. Do you know where that's found, Jonny?
Yeah. I like to say the love of Christ constrains us. But not everyone likes my weird translations.
That feels a little different.
For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge, and if one died for all, then we're all dead. How about we don't do the King James Version?
Right. Now I'm thoroughly confused.
I will say this. I will say the King James Version of the Bible is beautiful, even if it's inaccurate. You know, it has a poetic quality to it, and some of the passages we even get, like through a glass darkly at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, that only comes from the KJV. You know, so respect. All right, here's the New Revised Standard. For the love of Christ urges us on, because we are convinced that one has died for all, and therefore all have died. Urges. English Standard says controls. And then the NIV is the one that we're familiar with, says, for the love of Christ compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. That word is really interesting. How it's just so... Isn't there something to it? When you see a word in 4 different translations that's used in 4 different ways, it means it's evocative, right? It's hard to define. What is Christ's love actually doing here? Constraining us, compelling us, urging us, controlling us even.
It's not a passive thing.
Yeah, definitely.
There might even be something in it that feels like wrath.
Totally. Thanks again, Jordan, for writing to us. We really appreciate the commentary, even if it was on something that I wrote. We want feedback on the blog, on the blog post, on the podcast. So even in this little talkback section, or what Jeff James brings, or if you want to talk about what we watched, or how to slice lasagna, which was on the last week's episode. I got some talkback about that. They just said slice it right away, and I said fine, you'll have a lasagna soup. You can do that if you want.
Let it rest.
I was getting attacked for saying weights to slice. That's offensive. Cut the bread in half. Who cares if it dries out, Just take the steak out of the pan and bite it, like it's a candy bar.
We're barbarians.
Talk back to us about any of that. We'd love to hear from you. Resist and Restore podcast at circleofhope.net. And while you write back to us, be sure to review us. We want your positive review. Give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to this and write us a review. That'll help more people find the podcast who are looking for it. And also share it with people that you think might be moved by it. Subscribe to it so that more people can get connected to it. The more subscribers and reviews that we have and shares, the more people can find it. And we really want people that would be blessed by this content to receive it. Similarly, if you're blessed by it, get connected to our church. There's a lot of ways you can do that. Go to circleofhope.church, find our Sunday meetings, all of which are hybrid on Zoom right now. Get connected to a cell, many of which are hybrid. Some of them are going back online because Omicron's a thing. That's terrible, but we're making it work. We're going to get it through. And also share money with us. Go to circleofhope.church and you can give money with us to help this podcast and help everything else that's happening. And also, quite frankly, loosen our own grips over our wallets. Learn to be generous and change how we relate to money. So lots of ways that you can get connected. We love you. We want to be connected to you. Keep talking back to us.
So I'm here with my friend Jeff James. Grateful for his presence here on our podcast today. He wrote a great book called Giving Up Whiteness. And Jeff, I know this book because I've had the opportunity to read it. It describes your personal journey toward anti-racism. How did you get started on this journey?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. It's always good to talk to you about this and any topic. But, I've thought a lot about this. Like, I tell people, like, I came from a very small Appalachian town. The town itself was all white. We had a few students of color from the small college that was there. But, so my sort of experience with this was a lot different than maybe my peers, from where I came from. But I always think in my mind that I had some seeds of interest in this topic planted in my brain at a really small age, because my dad was a college professor. And so I would often rub shoulders with little playmates, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, that were much more diverse because of the college campus. My dad, when he went to get his master's and PhD, we lived in like graduate student housing. So my friends were like from Afghanistan and China, and there's a couple African-American kids. And I really think, and we can talk about this later about how our brains form. I really think that as a small Appalachian kid, I had a different experience that just made me more interested in the topic. Now, over time, that led me to become interested in the topics of diversity, of equality. I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X in college. I read a lot about Martin Luther King. I was sort of abnormally interested in the topic than a typical, white dude of my age at the time. But in a way that almost made it more difficult in some ways, because I sort of went through life feeling like, okay, I'm sort of one of the good guys on this topic. I get it. Mm-hmm. I'm for equality. I have, fairly diverse friends, again, compared to most white people. But it kind of blinded me in a way. And the blindness got sort of shaken a little bit from the sort of driving trigger of this was an interaction with my friend Crystal. She's an author, a poet, an activist in West Virginia. She's also an entrepreneur, just started a Black-owned newspaper. And it was in 2015. It was right after the church shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, which was just horrific. And I texted her and I said, what else can I do as a white person, to help other white people get on board with anti-racism? And her response was, it's very simple. White people are not white. Get rid of whiteness. And even with all of my, sort of emotional buy-in on all these topics, that took me aback, because I'd never been challenged to even think about whiteness and what that even meant and how could you even give it up. It just felt like, okay, I'm a white male. What aspects of my identity am I actually able to give up? Because everyone thinks that race is biological and it's assigned and whatever. And it just took me on a journey of what the heck is race? Like I never even started the journey with that question. And boy, I learned a lot when I did. And that's really what got the whole thing started.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of, I've heard people when they hear the title of your book say something like, that's really ambitious. Can white people even make the choice to give up our whiteness?
Well, it offends people on two levels. There are people that get offended and say, well, are you asking Black people to give up their Blackness? So there's that reaction. But then for people that are a little more, on board emotionally with this topic, there's a little bit of offense in the sense of, you can't actually do that, because then you're sort of walking away from the responsibility of what the white legacy has been. And so I think I have responses for both of those questions, but yeah, it can be tough to even ponder the question.
Yeah. Isn't a big part of our work gaining awareness of our whiteness and owning how that impacts others in our country? I think that's what you mean by the responsibility. So what do you mean by giving up?
Yeah. Well, I will say that, yes, the first step by far is an awareness and an embracing of that whiteness exists. What is it, but also, acknowledging that it exists, and certainly acknowledging the implications of it throughout history and in our modern era. So, it was kind of odd because this book came out like last year. It was during all the flood of big best-selling anti-racism books, and people would often say, how's this different? What is this? And in a way, it's kind of like the next step after you understand whiteness, because you do have to understand it in order to discern whether is it something I'm supposed to embrace or give up. And so, yes, part of it is going through a deep acknowledgement of understanding that whiteness is, the way I describe whiteness is like, it's a perspective, right? It's a worldview and a social and a personal positioning of yourself relative to everyone else. And it really is a somewhat kinder version of saying white supremacy. It really is in many ways. But it's essentially, it doesn't even have to have animosity towards other groups. It's just the assumption that the standards that have been created by European ancestors all the way up to, today, that whiteness is the standard of culture and just way of life that is the best. It's like, we've achieved this amazing thing, and how does everyone else compare to it? And, I talk a lot about the ability to see that as kind of like a table that you're sitting at. Is it a table that you're simply inviting people to, or is it a table that you all equally built together? And I can get into that here in just a bit, but whiteness is that white gaze that Toni Morrison would write. She used to say, whenever she would write, she was like, I want to write freely as a Black woman, and sometimes just as a human without thinking, what is the white audience going to think? And so that's kind of the dynamic of whiteness. Is like, it's this like monolithic standard of how we think and do things. And once we realize that's what it is and how it got developed, then you can start that process of understanding, wow, how would we dismantle this and make it an actual table that we could all build together?
Yes. Thank you. You really take a lot of time to kind of expose the lie of biological white supremacy by talking about the construction of pseudoscientific race theories and European colonialism and hegemony, and what we know about DNA now. And I knew a lot about those first two areas of study, but I was surprised by the last to hear about DNA. Can you tell us about those DNA similarities between human beings across racial differences?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a scientist, so everyone should go read real science on all this. I encourage people to really do their own research on it. But honestly, this is kind of like one of those scientific realizations that has gone all the way back into the 1990s when they mapped the human genome, right? So that was when Bill Clinton stood up and said, we've done it. We've actually mapped the human genome. They were already at that point. Scientists were observing, like, there is no DNA difference between humans. Humans, look at it this way. If humans are like, a species or something, and we compare it to other, groups, tigers and penguins and, whatever group of animals, human DNA is more closely mapped together than even the same animals in the same family. So you could have two penguins of the same exact little, I don't know what they call penguin families, a penguin pod or something. But those two penguins could be further apart genetically than human beings of different races. So if you could have an Asian person and sort of European ancestry person, that they're going to be closer in DNA than even the two tigers from the same tiger family. It's really fascinating. And the thing that really blew my mind is that the DNA sort of difference between two people could be larger within the same race than it is between two people of different races. So in other words, the DNA findings are showing that, first of all, we're only really different at about 0.1% level of DNA difference between, humans. And that really just sort of guides the development of the external stuff, skin color, hair type, certain little physical features for the most part. And so when you realize that, you're like, wow, we really have built a centuries long way of dividing ourselves with deadly consequences over 0.1% DNA difference. Like, just think about that for a minute. And so, sociologists and other people have been talking about race as a socially constructed thing. Yes, it got socially constructed because there's some shortcuts that we assign people that might look a little different than we do. And it's sort of a brain trick that says, oh, they must be culturally and in many other ways different than I am. And it's just a trick of the brain. But socially, that's how things got constructed, is humans have always tried to divide each other. We have a million ways to divide ourselves. But race became a shortcut, and it became a way of scaling the impact of the difference on these really, honestly, superficial and silly external features. And so that's where all the social construct of race has come from. But if you really get down to how do you define biologically race, it falls apart quickly, because you can't really do it on skin color. You can't really do it on hair type, because there's anomalies every time you try to define it physically. It falls apart.
That's amazing. Speaking of the differences in our very racialized society built on these constructs, I appreciated how you named so much white affirmative action in the history of the United States. Can you give us a few examples here that were especially eye-opening to you on your personal journey?
Yeah, this was a big one, because, our mutual public or even private educations on these historical issues are just criminally negligent in terms of, really giving us the full history of what's happened. But, today you say affirmative action, that immediately conjures up in a sort of white person's mind, oh, this is a program that is supposed to go fix the wrongs that have been done to a person of color. Particularly, it gets associated with African American, kind of programs and such. And people don't realize affirmative action today is extremely narrow and limited. In other words, if a company systematically discriminated against, let's say, African American applicants, and that was proven in court, then there's an affirmative action remedy to go fix, that problem. But what actually happened from a Eurocentric, Euro ancestry, white, perspective is that the entire society that built up around you, what we know now as the United States of America, was affirming and acting on that affirmation of Eurocentricity and whiteness from the beginning. And, we know that in many ways, like, there were decisions about who could be a citizen that were Eurocentric. There were, obvious cultural things that happened. But people don't realize that the US government had a very direct and specific policy and program intention. And a couple of the examples that just blew me away were, one was the Homestead Act. Some people might know what that is, but it's essentially was a land giveaway. Mm-hmm. They took millions of acres of land from indigenous people, Native Americans, and just said, hey, go populate the West, or go populate the Midwest to the West. And you didn't have to pay for it. It was literally a giveaway. Right. All you had to do was pay a little processing fee. And so thousands of white families got literally land given to them. All they had to do was promise to go settle it and, farm it or whatever. And as we all know, back then, property was the wealth building thing, for that type of an economy. And so, of course, what happened was almost no people of color got those grants. It was very systematic. Less than 0.3% of those land grants went to Black people, newly freed enslaved people or formerly enslaved people. It was just blatant. And so to this day, the research shows that about 50% of white families in the US have an ancestor who benefited from that land giveaway. Wow. So it was literally affirmative action for white citizens to, become, create wealth from land. And another quick example that my family benefited from, my dad was in the military, he was in the Army, and everyone's probably heard of the GI Bill. Once you come out of the military, they pay for your school. Back then they had incredible, basically free money to buy a house, a lot of different benefits. And once again, people of color were systematically, completely locked out of those benefits, which, by the way, created a massive up level of middle class, economic growth. And people went to college, they, got better jobs, they created income. So today, when people say, to this day, the average African-American family, even at the same college degree level, has an average of $10,000 of, personal wealth, or, just sort of your net worth is about $10,000. And the exact same white family with the same credentials has $100,000 of net worth on average. And a lot of it goes back to this fact that, a lot of this is land, it's property, it's the ability to buy a bigger home, get the equity in the land. And that goes all the way back. So whether it's GI Bill, billions of dollars given away, I find it really ironic that whenever we talk about major investments in education, or, just helping people thrive with the infrastructure of life, that it gets like, oh my gosh, that's just an incredibly socialist thing to do. We've done that for generations in this country. It was just for white people. Mm-hmm. So that's been quite an eye opener to see the impact of all that. It works. When you give people resources, guess what? They thrive, they use it. So why don't we do that today,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Speaking of all these benefits and unearned privileges, you sometimes talk about racism as an addiction for white folks. How does that work in the brain and in our lives? And is there any hope for recovery?
This was one of my biggest fears going into this research, because there's a little bit of depressing sort of, you just see all this stuff that's happened over the years. And, you're like, is this just kind of hardwired into humans to be like this, And, in some ways the answer is kind of yes, but in other ways it's not. And why I say that is our brains have been developed, over time in ways that help us survive and help us, do what we do as humans. And one of the things the brain does is it takes shortcuts because it's always conserving energy. It's not, if the brain doesn't have to think about something, it's like, yay, I don't want to think about that. I'll focus on these other things. And so whenever that happens, you have these shortcuts, and there's a lot of psychologists that have researched this and shown how many really dumb mistakes that we as humans make because our brains just want to be lazy. And racism takes advantage of that. It, like I said, whenever if the brain says, oh, person with darker skin, scary, I should be suspicious, whatever, that's a shortcut. Or, there's many other stereotypes that have sort of arisen, and the brain's sort of just taking a shortcut. And what was scary is that little toddlers of like age 2, 3, 4 would show these preferences for their own skin color. If you put them, like if you threw a bunch of diverse babies in in like a playroom, they would start migrating towards the little kids who had the same, sort of external features. And I was like, wow, that sucks. That's not a good thing. But think about it. Our brains are mostly formed from age 0 to 3. I mean, that's why everyone's like, preschool is pretty dang important, It's important, the environment that kids grow up in. So they did more study, and they showed that kids that grow up in an environment where diverse people are a part of their lives from the beginning, whether it's in their own family, whether it's in, their neighborhood or their play group, that actually does rewire the brain. And those same kids, when they became toddlers, did not show the same proclivity to go crawl over to the white kids or the black kids. They were actually, very, very open. There was no difference. So, sorry to go so long on that, but it's very important for us to realize that, yes, the brain has its favorite ways of operating, but we have the ability to remap and rewire those tendencies. So what becomes a subconscious problem with racism, we really can't, and if we're purposeful about it, put ourselves in environments and other experiences that change the grooves in our brain. And so the subconscious reaction is no longer at sort of a racist or a, sort of an exclusive experience. They call this neuroplasticity, the brain scientists. And it's powerful. It's encouraging. And they're working on this with like state police, people that are doing training with law enforcement, because there are these hair trigger, decisions that they have to make. And if their brain is wired to be biased, then guess what? We are going to have the problems that we have. But the good news is, yes, we actually can do it. It just takes major commitment and a purposeful approach to it. So, yeah. So I'm sorry, you asked about addiction. So, the brain operates off of dopamine for good feelings and validation. It just you have a good experience and it just floods your brain with, feel good. And a lot of this, as little babies, we grow up in an environment, a white culture developed to benefit and reward white, sort of lighter skinned people. Those are little pops of dopamine every single day, all day, to the point where you're like, yeah, I'm walking down the street, I'm feeling okay to be white in a white society. And if you're starting to get challenged a little bit on that, guess what? You're going to react like an addict reacts when they're not truly embracing their addiction, which is another very, very defensive. And I've talked to people that, are in recovery or have been in, and they feel like, yeah, this is a good analogy, because that's how people act. If you're not admitting you have a problem, you act very defensive when it's brought up. And guess what? That's what a big portion of white culture is reacting to right now. We're like, wait, well, I'm not an addict. I'm not, I'm not addicted. Like, oh, nope, yes, we are. We are absolutely addicted.
Oh my gosh. Yes, we're seeing that. It's so resonant.
It also, to me, in a way, because it's very easy for all of us to condemn other people that haven't become, open to these concepts. It's very easy to look at folks and say, wow, a bunch of racist idiots or whatever. But when you start realizing how this stuff tricks us, that's not letting people off the hook, but it's also giving us less reason to be judgmental, because we are all affected by this.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to create practical and powerful pathways to get someone from here to here, just like we would if someone was addicted to drugs or alcohol. We no longer just sort of cast those people off. We realize it's a disease. We've got to help, get people a pathway of freedom. And I feel like that could really help us bridge some of the gaps, is to see each other as we're all addicts, at whatever level. Some of us are more aware of it. Some of us are working on it. Some of us are in recovery. Some people aren't, but we're all still addicts. And so we've got to do a better job.
Yep. In the church, we say we're all recovering from the sin addiction.
Yeah.
So, that does put us together. I really loved, I want to ask you more about that table image that you mentioned earlier, Jeff. Building a new table that is anti-racism versus the assimilationist view or invitation to the table that's already owned and set by white people.
Yeah.
How do we get beyond an assimilationist mindset and practice?
Yeah, that's probably the question that people are wondering most about, because for the percentage of the population that have gotten to the point where we say, yes, we admit there's still a major problem. We understand white privilege. We understand whiteness. The next question is, well, what's different? How does this look different than what we've been doing? And to me, just to be clear, assimilation is, again, that white-centric standard where we're inviting people to come and be equal with us as white people. Okay, person of color, come on into our institution or our church or our friend group. As long as you kind of act like us, you're very welcome, to be in that. That's assimilation. Anti-racism is understanding that we lower the assumption that our way is the superior way and create a set of new ways of interacting as humans that is equally contributed to by various, groups of people. And there's, we don't have time to get into all the stuff about, how different cultures solve different problems in valid ways, just different ways. But that's essentially how it happens. So for me, it begins with questioning everything. This is a hard exercise, but let's just take our church, for example. If we just said, all right, let's walk into the church or look at the website, find out when we have our meetings, find out how we do cells, and just go through that with open eyes from a non-white centric perspective. How does that come across? What are our daily practices, our assumptions? Where did these come from? Are they really useful? Are they really truly the best thing to do? Or is it just because we prefer to do it that way? And if we had a completely diverse group of people who created the same experience together, how would that look different than if it was a group of white folks who did it and then tried to invite people of color into it? So it's just a complete reorienting of the assumptions. And when I think of the verse, Jesus talked about new wineskins, right? Mm-hmm. It really creating completely new wineskins for this new wine, because we're trying to force fit anti-racism into an assimilationist, sort of mindset, and it just doesn't work. It just falls apart quickly. So it's really about reframing and redeveloping an entirely new system together. And I would argue, a lot of people will say, well, the church, our church, whatever church, is still 90% white or 85% white. So how in the world do we do that? And I would simply argue to say that if you're serious about this, even if, you may have a small number of people of color in the congregation, if you're serious about creating a space that is truly anti-racist, you will over-index on leaders and influencers of color in the group of people who are making decisions about what this place will look like. So, it can't necessarily be like, okay, we got 90% white people, so we're going to have 9 white leaders, 1, black leader, and expect that to change anything. That's not. Mm-hmm. You have to almost say, let's have 90% black leaders and one white leader, and then, or have a representation of every group, at some point. There's been some political research on some of these dynamics, and it scares people who are afraid of giving up a majority influence. Mm-hmm. But it really is like Jesus said, where you tip the scale, like, whoever is at the bottom in terms of representation, if you're serious about this, you put them at the top of representation and leadership, and then that trickles down into the 90% white sort of community. And it's scary for some people, but I think it's radical, and I think it's a Jesus thing to do, is to over-index on representation.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered your question, but those are just some thoughts.
Yes, I'm so glad you're getting us into Jesus's words and images here, Jeff. I want to close with something about that, but first, you made up this great word, uniquality. In what ways can you tell us about that word, and like what ways do you keep striving for it personally, and what does it look like to strive for it in the church?
Yeah, it's always fun to try to make up a word, and you got to hurry up and log it into Urban Dictionary. So,
love the Urban Dictionary.
I don't know, it just sort of came to my mind, but the reason why I sort of coined that term is because there are people that are fighting for equality that aren't necessarily interested in unity at this point. So equality would be that, yes, different pockets of groups would have equal access to resources and power. Mm-hmm. But they all might still hate each other, and they might compete all the time, but they have equal access to stuff. So that's sort of, okay, equal access to things. Unity is what often happens in a church, to say, we got to stay united on this. We can't be fractious about this issue. We don't want to run people off. We want to be united. But in the process, they've completely ignored the fact that things are not equal right now. There are serious harms being done, but we can't talk about it because that would shatter our unity. But if you bring that together, and we're serious about equal representation, equal voice, and we do it in a spirit of unity, that's uniquality. And I would argue that that's the only way to fundamentally get to an abundance mindset, where instead of people thinking there's a scarcity mindset that we have to compete over, that if you get something, that means I don't get something. That's completely the wrong way to look at it. The way to look at it is your contribution, my contribution creates something way bigger and better that we can all benefit from. So that to me, uniquality and abundance mindset go together. And I think that's the vision that's often missing, because we're very good about saying what we're against, and we're not painting a very good picture of what we're for and how exciting that could be. And I talk in the book a little bit about, gosh, I hate eating right. I have such a sweet tooth, and I'm just a junk food addict. And so I got to find my passion, right? Like, what's that vision for better health? But I have found it in this issue of equality and diversity, because to me, the richness of what I've learned and the relationships that I have and the vision that I can see in an anti-racist, pro-uniquality environment, that motivates me to keep going. That doesn't get me. So when we have a tough meeting like we did in New Jersey, you can still see that thing to say, that's what we need. We're stuck here right now, but this is where we're going. And that keeps you going.
Yes. We need something to shoot for, some hope. does along those lines, does Jesus have any particular instructions for white people? Obviously, he didn't use that word in his context, but do you think he has anything to say to white people, and how might that be different from many westernized expressions of Christian faith? And finally, like what hope does Christ have for us in this work?
Well, I don't want to be arrogant to say that like no humans can get this right without Jesus, but as Christians, yeah, I kind of think that no one can quite get this right without Jesus. And the reason is that, obviously Jesus has a lot to say for any group of people that are in power. And I know that there's a lot of white people, like I'll go home to my Appalachian friends and family, they don't feel often that they're in power. They feel crapped on like a lot of other groups. And so it's tough to sort of admit that we do have some power. But Jesus constantly taught that if you want to be great, you serve. If you want to be first, you seek to be last. If you have a banquet or a wedding feast, you invite people that normally would get completely ignored in that experience. So, I mean, you just trip all over Jesus's teachings all through the gospel. You really have to be purposefully blind not to see what Jesus is saying to white culture in the circumstance that we are in over the last several hundred years. And that is, you have incredible power as a majority, and you have incredible resources on average. And if you're not, again, tipping that triangle, upside down, so that the people who have had no access to that or limited access are included and elevated. That my favorite words these days are elevation and inclusion. That's our mindset. That's the Jesus teaching, is include and elevate people that normally have been left out. And by the way, I've become very sensitive to the fact that it's not because they're victims or because they're weak or because, gosh, let's help the poor people that haven't. No, we who have been in the dominant culture have been weakened by our own racism. Mm-hmm. We've been blinded, we've lost out. And so, yes, that's not denying the actual, horrific harm that has been done, but we cannot go about it thinking that we're the benevolent folks that are going to reach down and elevate people. No, we are sick because of elevating ourselves. And that's what Jesus taught all the time. You elevate yourself, you include only people that include you, you're not doing it right. You're not living out the kingdom. And so to me, it's like, this whole work is not, it's no longer about, gosh, I'm a good guy and I'm going to go help people. It's more like, what can I learn? I am missing out on life because I don't have enough diversity in my life. Or I've lived a sort of, westernized US consumerist, kind of life. And I've missed out on the richness of what life really is about. So I could go on and on about that, but that to me is the Jesus influence. And then you combine that with the fact that you have to have a sense of worth. Your identity has to be changed in Christ so that you're not addicted to that whiteness identity anymore. Like you let go of that, your identity's in Christ. That's what Paul was talking about when he said, there's no longer Jew or Gentile, Greek or slave, or, none of that stuff, male or female, because our identities are in Christ. And that should free you now to go on this path. And then finally, I would just say spirit power. Like you have to rely on the Spirit of God to help us to do this, because on our own, we can't do it. And I think, honestly, that's why a lot of charismatic churches that are very spirit oriented are the most diverse churches we have in this culture. Mm-hmm. That's just measurably true. And so I think there's something to that they've invited the Spirit into their church, their worship, and they've, from well over 100 years ago, charismatic churches have been on the cutting edge of bringing people together across different boundaries. So,
Yes. I'm thinking of Azusa Pacific.
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And that includes women too. Like they've been on the cutting edge of female preachers and pastors. And, there's a lot of legacy there that we can learn from.
Oh, Jeff, this is so rich. Thank you so much. That is a lot. You've named a lot of hope in Christ. If we're willing as white people to listen and to learn and to do this work of giving up, recognizing. I love how you said we're sick from elevating ourselves.
Yeah.
If we can see that, hear that word in love from Jesus, and go on a journey like this with him, I think there's a lot of hope. So thank you for your inspiration. Thank you for being willing to share your experiences and your thoughts, your own journey with God, and having it in community with us here. Really grateful to you, friend.
Well, I appreciate your leadership and all the folks that have been fighting this fight, for quite some time. And gosh, there's a lot of stub toes that, my whole life is one giant stubbing of a toe after the other on this. So yeah, let's all do it in grace, but let's also do it in real commitment, because God will get us there. It'll be great. So
may it be so. Amen.
All right, we want to end here with spiritual show and tell. We always want to share what's nourishing to our soul, hoping that it could nourish you too. So, pastors, what's been feeding you this week that we can share with everyone else?
What's his name? Lin-Manuel Miranda, that's his name? Hamilton guy? He wrote the soundtrack for Encanto. This guy's making lots of money. It's the number one soundtrack on Spotify and iTunes and all, number one album even, But let me tell you something, there's a reason for it. Because, first of all, the soundtrack's great, right? But the movie itself is so moving. It's about this Latin American generational trauma that's coming through this household, and this abuela that's feels so responsible for keeping the house together and keeping the house magical because it's magical and all these people have special gifts and so on. And she doesn't see the cracks in the house that Mirabel sees. Mirabel has a vision that her uncle Bruno gives her, and she doesn't see the cracks in the house. She can't see, but Mirabel can. And she wants to feed back to her abuela, hey, the house is in danger. The candle that gives us the magic is going to go out. And abuela doesn't want to see it. It would be she can't handle the truth about how her house might fall apart. But they get through that. She listens, she responds, and then the house is destroyed, but they build it together. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's a beautiful image of the church, and even our church, right? Tension, disagreement, conflict, harm. Yeah, it threatens to break us apart or split us apart. But we have an opportunity this year to rebuild something together, to do something new, to make something happen. That's exciting, and that's inspiring to me. So, and it is a beautiful movie. It's so colorful, it's gorgeous, and I really do recommend it to you. So get someone's Disney Plus login and get on the movie so you can watch it. You feel me?
It's good. It is really good.
I really did like it. And there's this song called Surface Pressure that the character who plays Louisa sings. And boy, it is about, she's this strong older sister that can just handle everything, like Rachel, where she holds the whole family's trauma and she can handle, her gift is strength, so she holds it all. But even she's a person, even her superpower of strength isn't strong enough to endure all of it. Mm-hmm. So I obviously really like this movie, but it has definitely nourished my soul. Thanks for letting me Thanks for indulging me, as they say.
It's good. It's worth watching. I love the moment where she's like trying to see into the future, and she's like, am I hugging? Am I fighting? Am I hugging? Am I fighting? Like it's so relatable. There's so many moments in there that we see the character's humanity, and yeah, it's a beautiful story.
Yes, and their connection with each other really does pull the whole rebuilding project into focus. Like, I love how she calls Bruno out from, like, inside the walls.
Totally.
Spoiler alert.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Oh, my gosh. So bad at that.
The movie stands up on its own, even if it is spoiled.
This is true.
I just told you the whole premise. I just told you the whole movie, you know?
You should still watch it.
That's right. That's right.
Another thing, I watched this a few weeks ago, but it's sticking with me. The movie, also on Netflix, or no, the Encanto.
It is on Netflix.
Yes, it is on Netflix, called Don't Look Up. If you haven't seen this yet, I highly recommend it. It's a great commentary on our culture, reminiscent of climate change, and in a very humorous way, I think reveals how our culture, like, kind of, we stick our heads in the sand and distract ourselves from the truth sometimes rather than wanting to face it. My favorite part, though, is this person of faith, this unlikely person of faith who comes in near the end of the movie. He's a skateboarder guy, and man, I just love those skateboarder guys. They're, you
got one at home.
I do. And they
He's not a shoplifter, though, right? The one at home.
Right. He's not.
That's good.
He's not, but they, I think the stereotype is true in many ways, that they like to think for themselves and kind of anti-establishment, but in a good way, where they're not getting all caught up in the distractions and the distractions from the truth. And this character just kind of has real faith in God. And for me, it was just the most poignant. It was the saving grace of the whole scene, of everything that is happening at the end. This kid has faith that God is going to, somehow take us through to the other side, and he kind of brings people together around that great truth. So
it's beautiful.
All right, well, I'll offer one more viewing recommendation. I have been watching the Kaminsky Method, which is a series with Michael Douglas, about his character and his best friend, and they are end of life. I want to say end of life, but they're not they're not dying, but they are later in life friends, and they are moving through the difficulties of aging, the loss, and just the ups and downs of relationships with each other, and they're very funny. So I'm enjoying it, one, because it's making me laugh, but also it's interwoven with all of that are these beautiful, poignant scenes. Michael Douglas's character is an acting coach, and he has these real poignant moments with his students where he's actually teaching them about how life works and how to be connected to your own humanity and the humanity of others. And he's saying these things that then he really struggles to live out himself. So it's a great mix of humor and truth, I guess. But sadly, I have to make this is a spoiler alert. I got to the third season and it's terrible. So So for anybody out there who's interested and watches this, I recommend the first 2 seasons.
It did not nourish your soul.
I stopped. Yeah, I couldn't handle the last.
Julie, it gets better. It gets better toward the end. You might want to keep going.
Really? Okay, well, we'll see. To be continued.
See, this is why spoilers are good, by the way. You spoil this show, you keep watching it.
I mean, for 2 seasons, it was really good.
I just have to say, don't you love the waiter in the restaurant that they always...
Oh, my word.
He's hunched over and, like, you think the drink is going to spill every time. I don't know how it doesn't spill.
Yeah. It's got a lot of everyday moments that they make really hilarious. All right. Well, that's good enough. Hopefully you can make some space to enjoy some of this entertainment that we've shared with you in some way that it can nourish your soul, not just a way to check out of life, but to, gain something from it. And write back to us. Tell us what's nourishing your soul. Make a recommendation. I need a new series to watch. Thanks for listening. Again, write to us at Resist and Restore Podcast at circleofhope.net.
One, two, three. You're listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope pastors where we're expressing... Damn it! I did it again! I really tried not to!